Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there exists a pantheon of demigods whose very names shake the foundations of reality. They are the Primarchs, the Emperor's own sons, genetically crafted to be the perfect instruments of conquest and unity. Each one stands as a monument to human ambition and martial excellence, towering figures who stride across battlefields like living legends. But among these titans of war, a question echoes through the void-scarred halls of the Imperium and the twisted domains of chaos alike. Who among them can claim the title of strongest? The question itself carries layers of meaning that spiral outward like the arms of a galaxy. Strength, after all, manifests in forms as varied as the Primarchs themselves. There is the brute force that can shatter adamantium with bare hands, the tactical brilliance that can orchestrate the deaths of billions with a word, the psychic might that can unmake stars, and the indomitable will that refuses to break even when flesh fails. Some Primarchs embody one aspect of power so completely that they define it. Others balance multiple attributes into a devastating whole. Understanding their might requires us to journey through the chronicles of the Great Crusade, the tragedy of the Horus Heresy, and the endless war that followed. The creation of the Primarchs stands as perhaps the Emperor's greatest achievement, a feat of bioengineering and warpcraft that has never been replicated. Working in secret beneath the Himalayan mountains of ancient terror, the master of mankind combined his own genetic template with forces drawn from the Imperium itself. The result was 20 superhuman infants, each one designed to excel in specific aspects of warfare and leadership. They were not merely enhanced humans or even particularly powerful space marines. They were something fundamentally different, beings who existed partially outside the normal laws of physics and psychology. Each Primarch possessed baseline abilities that would have made them legendary in their own right. They stood anywhere from 10 to 12 feet tall, their frames packed with muscle that could generate force far beyond what their size should allow. Their bones were dense as ceramite, their skin tough enough to turn aside blades, their metabolisms capable of processing toxins that would kill normal humans instantly. They could perceive events at speeds that made combat seem to unfold in slow motion, their minds processing tactical information faster than any cogitator. They required minimal sleep, could survive in extreme environments, and aged at rates so slow as to be effectively immortal. But these commonalities served only as the foundation upon which their individual greatness was built. Beyond the physical, the Primarchs possessed an almost supernatural charisma that bent lesser beings to their will through presence alone. A Primarch could walk into a room filled with enemies and command attention, respect, even obedience, through nothing more than their bearing. They inspired loyalty in their gene-sons that transcended reason, devotion so complete that space marines would willingly march into certain death at their word. This aura of authority stemmed partially from their enhanced biology, but also from something deeper, something connected to the warp energies that helped shape them. They were symbols as much as soldiers, living embodiments of ideals that could move masses to action. The Primarchs also possessed what might be called psychic presence, though this manifested differently in each of them. Some, like Magnus and Lorgar, wielded obvious sorcerous powers that could reshape reality directly. Others, like Russ and Vulcan, had abilities that were more subtle but no less potent, their connection to the warp expressing itself through seemingly impossible feats of physical prowess or unnatural resilience. Even those Primarchs, who seemed to possess no psychic talent at all, carried an imprint in the warp that marked them as something beyond merely mortal. This quality made them both weapons against the forces of chaos and, tragically, potential tools for those same dark powers. When the Chaos Gods stole the infant Primarchs from the Emperor's laboratory, scattering them across the galaxy through the warp, They unwittingly ensured that each demigod would be shaped by wildly different circumstances. Some landed on civilized worlds where they were raised in cultures of honor and learning. Others crashed into feral death worlds where survival required constant violence. A few found themselves on planets already touched by chaos corruption. These formative experiences combined with their inherent natures to produce 20 unique individuals, each one representing a different aspect of what humanity could become through genetic perfection and environmental pressure. The process of reuniting the Primarchs with their father and their legions took decades, but it ultimately gave the Great Crusade the leadership it needed to conquer the galaxy. Each Primarch took command of the Space Marine Legion created from his genetic material, transforming these already formidable warriors into extensions of his own tactical philosophy and combat doctrine. The legions reflected their gene fathers, adopting not just their fighting styles, but their values, their strengths, and tragically, their weaknesses. This bond between Primarch and Legion meant that evaluating a Primarch's power must also consider the forces he commands, the strategies he favors, and the impact he has on the wars he wages. As we examine the strongest among these demigods, we must understand that their battles with each other were often decided by factors beyond simple martial prowess. The circumstances of their encounters mattered immensely. A Primarch fighting on familiar terrain with his full legion at his back is a very different proposition from the same warrior wounded, alone, and caught by surprise. The weapons they wielded could tip the balance, as could environmental factors, morale, even the Primarch's emotional state at the time. Many of their recorded duels were interrupted before a clear victor emerged, or one combatant gained advantage through means that had nothing to do with skill or strength. Furthermore, the Horus Heresy fundamentally changed many Primarchs in ways that make comparisons between their pre-corruption and post-corruption forms difficult. Those who embraced chaos gained terrible power from the ruinous powers, becoming demon princes whose capabilities far exceeded their original forms. But they also lost aspects of themselves in the bargain, trading humanity for raw might in ways that altered the nature of their strength. A chaos-empowered Primarch might be able to perform feats impossible for their loyalist brothers, but they did so at a cost that extended beyond the merely physical. With these considerations in mind, we can begin to examine the greatest warriors among the Emperor's sons. We will walk through their accomplishments, analyze their battles, and try to understand what made each one a force that could reshape worlds. Some names will be familiar to anyone who has touched the lore of the Imperium. Others might surprise those who focus only on the most famous conflicts, but all of them earned their places through deeds that echo across 10,000 years of bloody history. The nature of strength itself becomes a philosophical question when discussing beings of such magnitude. Is the strongest Primarch the one who can lift the most weight, strike the hardest blow, endure the most punishment? Or is strength better measured in battles won, enemies slain, worlds conquered? Do we count only personal combat ability, or do we factor in their capacity to inspire, to lead, to change the course of wars through presence and command? These questions have no single answer, which is precisely what makes the discussion fascinating. Different perspectives will highlight different Primarchs as supreme, each view valid in its own context. As we journey through these profiles of power, imagine yourself standing on a battlefield where titans clash. The ground trembles beneath their footfalls. The air crackles with energy, both physical and psychic. Around them, armies of superhuman space marines wage war on a scale that beggars comprehension, but all eyes are drawn to the Primarchs themselves. In these moments, in the fury and skill and terrible beauty of their combat, we see what the Emperor's vision of perfection truly meant. We see humanity elevated beyond its natural limits, transformed into something that can stand against the horrors of a hostile universe. But we also see the flaws that made them vulnerable. For all their strength, the Primarchs were not invincible. They could be wounded, beaten, even killed under the right circumstances. More importantly, they could be corrupted. turned against the very ideals they were created to embody. The tragedy of the Horus heresy lies in watching these paragons of martial virtue tear themselves apart, brother fighting brother, in a civil war that shattered the dream of unity and doomed humanity to millennia of grinding warfare. The strongest among them often fell hardest, their very power making them prizes worth claiming for the dark gods. Let us begin our examination with the one Primarch whose name became synonymous with betrayal and whose power, when finally unleashed, nearly brought low the Emperor himself. Horus Lupercal, the War Master's dreadful might. Before he became the arch-traitor whose rebellion would reshape the galaxy, Horus Lupercal stood as the Emperor's most favored son, the first among equals, the War Master, given command over all the forces of the Great Crusade. His elevation to this position was not born of nepotism or blind favoritism. Horus earned his title through demonstrated excellence in every aspect of warfare. He was a brilliant strategist whose tactical acumen could orchestrate victories across entire sectors. He was a charismatic leader whose words could inspire devotion in skeptics and unity among rivals. And he was a devastating combatant whose skills with blade and talon made him a match for almost any opponent in personal combat. Horus combined abilities that other Primarchs possessed individually. Where Magnus wielded overwhelming psychic power but struggled in direct melee, and Angron dominated in close combat but lacked strategic depth, Horus excelled at both warfare's grand strategy and its intimate violence. He could command fleets and armies with the same facility with which he swung his Thunder Maul Worldbreaker. This versatility made him uniquely dangerous because he could engage enemies on multiple levels simultaneously, crushing their physical forces while outmaneuvering their commanders. His physical capabilities alone placed him in the upper tier of Primarch combatants. Horus stood taller than most of his brothers, his frame carrying muscle that could generate truly apocalyptic force. The weapons he wielded reflected this power. Worldbreaker was a thunder maul of such size that a normal human would have been crushed beneath its weight. When activated, its power field could shatter armored vehicles and reduce fortifications to rubble. A single blow from Worldbreaker could cave in even Primarch-grade armor. Horus wielded it one-handed despite its massive size, his strength so great that he could bring it around with shocking speed for something so large. His other signature weapon, the War Master's Talon, was a unique lightning claw that incorporated a combi bolter into its design. This masterwork of the Dark Age of technology allowed Horus to seamlessly blend ranged and melee combat, firing precisely aimed bolt rounds before tearing into enemies with claws that could shear through ceramite like parchment. The Talon was rumored to have been found on Chthoniya, his homeworld, a relic whose technology could not be replicated even by the Mechanicum's greatest artisans. After his fall, it would drink the blood of loyalists and traitors alike, eventually being claimed by Abaddon the Despoiler after Horus's death. But Horus's true genius lay in his approach to combat. He combined the practiced refinement of a Terran dueling master with the brutal pragmatism of a Chthonian gutter fighter. This meant he had no qualms about using whatever means necessary to gain advantage, whether that meant exploiting an opponent's emotional vulnerabilities, employing surprise tactics, or simply overwhelming them with focused aggression. He studied his opponents meticulously, learning their patterns and preferences, then crafting approaches specifically designed to counter their strengths while exploiting their weaknesses. During the Great Crusade, Horus demonstrated this adaptive brilliance repeatedly. He could match Sanguinius's aerial grace, counter Fulgrim's speed, weather Perturabo's calculated strikes, and even hold his own against the Lion's dueling mastery. While he might not have been absolutely supreme in any single martial aspect, his ability to adjust his fighting style made him extremely difficult to defeat. Opponents who tried to overwhelm him with force found him remarkably defensive. Those who attempted cautious technical approaches discovered he could explode into sudden violence. This unpredictability made fighting Horus exhausting because opponents could never settle into a rhythm or rely on a consistent strategy. His tactical brilliance extended his reach far beyond what he could accomplish with his own hands. Horus understood warfare as a system of interconnected pieces, where victories in one theater could enable advances elsewhere, where the appearance of strength could matter as much as actual force. He pioneered the strategy of decapitation strikes, using specialized forces to eliminate enemy leadership and creating chaos that his main army could exploit. Under his command, the Lunar Wolves, later the Sons of Horus, developed a reputation for surgical precision in warfare, able to dismantle enemy organizations with minimal collateral damage when that served their purposes, or unleash total annihilation when terror was required. The other Primarchs recognized his capabilities and generally respected his elevation to War Master, though some harbored jealousy. Leman Russ, who fancied himself the Emperor's executioner, acknowledged Horus's superiority in overall command, even while believing himself the better warrior. Robut Gilliman, himself a master of logistics and strategy, saw Horus as the only brother whose organizational skills matched his own while exceeding him in battlefield leadership. Even those who might have coveted the title, like Lionel Johnson, admitted that Horus had earned his position through merit. This widespread respect made his fall to chaos all the more devastating. The Horus who emerged from the temples of Davin was changed in ways that went far beyond simple corruption. The Chaos Gods did not merely twist his mind or offer him power. They fundamentally altered his nature, elevating him from demigod to something approaching true divinity. The transformation happened gradually, each act of betrayal binding him tighter to the ruinous powers, each oath broken feeding the darkness within him. By the time he led his traitor legions toward Terra, Horus Lupercal had become Horus, the arch-traitor, a being whose power eclipsed anything he had possessed during the Crusade. The empowerment chaos granted him manifested in multiple ways. His physical strength increased to levels that allowed him to contend with opponents who had previously been his equals or even superiors. When Leman Russ confronted him during the Siege of Terra, Horus dominated the combat, despite Russ being widely considered one of the physically strongest Primarchs. Even wielding the Spear of Russ, a weapon specifically crafted to harm beings of chaos, the Wolf King found himself overmatched. Horus caught him upon the War Master's talon and would have killed him if not for Russ's desperate counterattack that partially purged the chaos corruption. The fact that Horus withstood a blow from that sanctified spear and continued fighting speaks to the resilience the Dark Gods had granted him. His psychic abilities, which had always been present but relatively minor compared to brothers like Magnus, swelled to become genuinely frightening. By the time he faced the Emperor aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Horus wielded powers that could warp reality around him. He created zones where the laws of physics bent to his will, where his mere presence could drive lesser beings mad or turn them into gibbering spawn. His aura of corruption was so potent that even hardened space marines from his own legion struggled to maintain their sanity in his presence. Time itself seemed to fold around him, the boundaries between the material realm and the warp dissolving at his command. The duel between Horus and the Emperor stands as one of the most significant battles in Imperial history. Though accounts of what transpired differ wildly, what seems clear is that Horus had been elevated to such a degree that he could actually wound the Emperor, the same being who had crafted him from divine genetic material and warp energy. The Emperor's initial restraint, his unwillingness to use his full power against his beloved son, allowed Horus to strike blows that nearly proved fatal. According to most accounts, Horus burned the flesh from the Emperor's face, destroyed one of his eyes, tore his arm from its socket, and broke his back. For a time, it seemed possible that Chaos's champion might actually prevail. What changed the Emperor's approach varies depending on the source. Some accounts claim a brave but doomed warrior attacked Horus, who killed the man with casual glee, finally showing the emperor that his son was truly gone. Others suggest that Sanguinius's sacrifice, moments before the emperor's arrival, had already shown the depths of Horus's corruption. Regardless, once the emperor committed his full power, the outcome was never in doubt. The psychic assault he unleashed didn't merely kill Horus. It annihilated him on every level of existence, obliterating his body, scouring away his soul, and ensuring that even the dark gods could not reconstitute their champion. In those final moments, it is said that Horus's eyes showed regret, a flash of the loyal son he had been, but it came far too late. Evaluating Horus's strength requires acknowledging the vast gulf between his pre-heresy and post-heresy forms. Before his corruption, he was certainly among the most capable Primarchs, perhaps ranking in the top 5 or 6 in terms of pure combat ability, while being unmatched in overall military leadership. After receiving the Dark God's blessing, his power increased exponentially, likely making him the single most dangerous Primarch in direct combat. The fact that it took the Emperor's full might to destroy him, when that same Emperor had created all 20 Primarchs, suggests the staggering heights to which chaos had elevated him. However, this empowerment came with a price that extended beyond the merely moral. Horus sacrificed his agency, becoming a puppet whose strings were pulled by forces that cared nothing for his original ambitions. The strategic brilliance that had made him War Master gave way to increasingly erratic decision-making, driven by the 4 powers' conflicting agendas. His greatest strength, his ability to inspire loyalty and coordinate disparate forces toward common goals, was undermined by the very nature of chaos, which sowed discord and ambition among his followers. In the end, the power that made him nearly unstoppable in single combat contributed to his ultimate failure on the strategic level. His legacy endures in both inspiration and warning. Abaddon the Despoiler, who inherited the title of War Master, has spent 10,000 years trying to complete what Horus began, launching Black Crusade after Black Crusade against the Imperium. The Chaos Space Marine Legions still revere Horus's memory, seeing in his rebellion the moment when they were freed from the Emperor's tyranny to pursue their own dark destinies. But his name has also become synonymous with the ultimate betrayal, a reminder to loyal servants of the Emperor that even the greatest among them can fall if they allow pride, ambition, or despair to open their hearts to corruption. When we assess Horus among the strongest Primarchs, we must conclude that he occupies a unique position. In terms of all-around capability during the Great Crusade, he was likely the most complete Primarch, lacking the singular weaknesses that made his brothers vulnerable in specific situations. After his empowerment by chaos, he became arguably the single most powerful Primarch in terms of raw force and supernatural ability, a being who could wound the Emperor himself. But this power was conditional, dependent on the continued support of fickle deities, whose ultimate goal was the galaxy's destruction. The question of Horus's strength, then, cannot be separated from the question of what he paid to obtain it. As we turn from the War Master, we come to another Primarch, whose name echoes through eternity, but for very different reasons. Where Horus is remembered for betrayal, our next subject is venerated for sacrifice. Where Horus fell to chaos, he remained steadfastly loyal unto death. He was the angel, the one whom even his traitor brothers admitted was perhaps the greatest warrior among them all. Sanguinius, the angel's perfect grace. Among all the Emperor's sons, Sanguinius occupied a special place in the hearts of both humanity and his fellow Primarchs. He possessed a unique combination of devastating combat prowess and genuine nobility that made him beloved even by those who might otherwise have been rivals. Where other Primarchs inspired respect through fear or awe through power, Sanguinius generated genuine affection. His beauty was not merely physical, though his features were said to be flawless, but spiritual. He embodied ideals of heroism and self-sacrifice that others could only aspire to reach. And yet, For all his grace and glory, he was no gentle soul unsuited for the galaxy's harsh realities. Sanguinius was a warrior of such exceptional skill that his brothers, including those who prided themselves on combat excellence, acknowledged him as likely the finest fighter among them. His most distinctive feature set him apart from his brothers in a way that no amount of height or strength could match. Sanguinius possessed a pair of pure white feathered wings that grew from his shoulders, the span so vast that they could carry his armored form through the air with ease. Whether these wings were part of the Emperor's original design, or a mutation caused by the high radiation levels on his homeworld of Bal Secundus, remains a mystery even to the most learned Imperial scholars. What matters is that they gave him capabilities no other Primarch possessed. He could take to the skies during battle, diving from above to strike at his enemies, or rising beyond reach when tactical withdrawal was required. This three-dimensional combat capability made him extremely difficult to counter for opponents accustomed to ground-based warfare. But the wings represented more than mere tactical advantage. They symbolized something profound about Sanguinius's nature. He was, quite literally, an angel of the Emperor, a being who seemed to have stepped from the mythic tales of old Terra, where divine warriors brought light to darkness. This symbolism carried immense psychological weight. When Sanguinius descended from the sky in the midst of battle, his wings spread wide and his blade burning with holy fire, he inspired his allies to heights of courage they didn't know they possessed, while filling enemies with superstitious dread. The visual impact of a winged demigod in golden armor could break enemy formations before he even struck a blow. His combat style took full advantage of his unique physiology. Sanguinius fought with a grace that made battle look like deadly choreography, each movement flowing into the next with perfect economy of motion. He wielded the blade in carmine, a two-handed sword wreathed in flames, with such speed and precision that opponents described facing him as trying to fight a whirlwind that had somehow gained lethal intent. His aerial acrobatics allowed him to attack from angles that other warriors couldn't even conceive, diving from above to strike vulnerable points, then launching back into the air before counterattacks could land. This combination of speed, precision, and three-dimensional movement made him one of the most difficult Primarchs to fight. His strength, while perhaps not quite matching that of brothers like Vulcan or Ferrus Manus, was still immense enough to cleave through armored vehicles and shatter reinforced structures. More importantly, every ounce of that strength was applied with perfect technique. Sanguinius wasted no energy on theatrical displays or excessive force. His strikes went exactly where they needed to go, with precisely the amount of power required to achieve their purpose. This efficiency meant he could maintain his combat effectiveness far longer than more brutal fighters who exhausted themselves through sheer aggression. The battles against Ka'Bandha, the bloodthirster of Khorne, stand as the defining proof of Sanguinius's martial supremacy. Greater demons, particularly those chosen by Khorne as his favored servants, rank among the most dangerous entities in existence. They are beings of pure violence given form, creatures whose very essence is dedicated to slaughter and whose physical capabilities exceed those of most Primarchs. Ka'Bandha was among the greatest of these living weapons, a demon whose power had been tested against countless champions across millennia. When he targeted the Blood Angels and their Primarch during the ambush at Cygnus Prime, it was with the confidence of something that knew it was engineered specifically for killing. Their first encounter went badly for Sanguinius. The Bloodthirster caught him with its whip, dragging the angel from the sky and breaking his legs with a single terrible blow. For most warriors, including many Primarchs, such an injury would have meant defeat or death. The demon proceeded to slaughter hundreds of Blood Angels before Sanguinius's eyes, trying to break his spirit as thoroughly as it had broken his body. The psychic backlash from witnessing his son's deaths drove Sanguinius into unconsciousness, allowing the demon to believe it had triumphed. But Sanguinius possessed something that pure strength and martial skill alone cannot provide: an unbreakable will that refused to accept defeat, no matter the cost. When he awoke and confronted Kabanda a second time, still wounded but sustained by righteous fury and desperate need, the outcome was different. The battle was not easy. Bloodthirsters of Kabanda's magnitude don't fall to single blows or simple tactics. But Sanguinius had learned from their first encounter, adapted his approach, and fought with a ferocity that matched the demon's own, while maintaining the precision that made him deadly. The duel raged across Cygnus Prime, until finally Sanguinius managed to break Kabanda's back over his knee and hurl the demon back into the warp. The fact that he could defeat such a creature while nursing injuries that would have crippled other Primarchs speaks to his exceptional combat ability and indomitable spirit. Their final confrontation during the Siege of Terror was briefer, but no less significant. Kabanda had been given a specific mission by Horn: kill 500 Blood Angels in Sanguinius's presence within a set time limit. The greater demon tore through Imperial defenders, each kill bringing him closer to his goal. When Sanguinius intervened, weakened by months of constant warfare and bearing wounds from previous battles, including his confrontation with the demon Prince Angron, Kabanda believed victory was assured. Instead, the angel rallied himself one last time. Calling upon reserves of strength that should not have existed, Sanguinius lifted the bloodthirster by its neck and, using the hilt of his sword, broke its spine before casting it back into the traitor army below. This final victory over his nemesis came at enormous cost, draining the last of Sanguinius's vitality, but it secured the Eternity Gate and allowed the Emperor's psychic barrier to hold. The respect other Primarchs held for Sanguinius's combat abilities cannot be overstated. Leman Russ, who claimed the title of Emperor's Executioner and considered himself among the most fearsome warriors in the Imperium, openly acknowledged that Sanguinius was likely the better fighter. Rogel Dawn, whose own capabilities were beyond question, stated that the angel was the single greatest combatant in the Imperium. Even Jagatai Khan, the White Scar's Primarch, and himself a warrior of legendary skill, deferred to Sanguinius in assessments of pure fighting ability. The traitor Primarchs, too, showed unusual wariness around him. Horus specifically targeted the Blood Angels at Cygnus Prime because he knew that Sanguinius would never turn to chaos and represented one of the few brothers who might actually defeat him in single combat. Perhaps the most telling proof of Sanguinius's prowess came during his final confrontation with Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit.
You know, I've been obsessed with Warhammer lore for quite a while, and honestly, the more I dig into the Primarchs, the more I realize how brilliantly tragic they all are. Like, we're sitting here debating who could beat who in a fight, but the real tragedy is that these brothers were literally designed to be humanity's saviors, and half of them ended up tearing the Imperium apart. Sometimes when I'm reading about their duels and rivalries, I can't help but think about how the Emperor must have felt watching his sons destroy each other. Anyway, let's continue.
By this point, the War Master had been elevated to apocalyptic power by the Chaos Gods, transformed into something that could wound even the Emperor. Sanguinius faced this empowered monster, while already exhausted from months of continuous warfare, bearing injuries that would have killed lesser beings, and knowing that he stood no real chance of victory. Yet he fought anyway, not out of foolish hope, but because he understood that his sacrifice might weaken Horus enough for the Emperor to finish what he started. The accounts vary on details, but all agree that Sanguinius managed to inflict genuine damage on Horus before falling, chipping the War Master's armor in a way that might have allowed the Emperor's power to penetrate. For a Primarch in Sanguinius's condition, to harm chaos-empowered Horus at all represents a feat of skill and will that few of his brothers could have matched. Sanguinius's combat ability extended beyond mere technical proficiency with weapons. He possessed what modern commentators might call situational awareness, taken to superhuman levels. He could process the flow of battle at speeds that made him seem prescient, positioning himself exactly where he needed to be to intercept threats or exploit openings. This tactical acuity, combined with his physical gifts, made him not just a powerful individual combatant, but a force multiplier for entire armies. When Sanguinius fought alongside his blood angels, he didn't simply kill enemies more efficiently than his sons. He inspired them to fight better, creating a synergy that elevated their collective performance beyond what should have been possible. There are whispers in the imperial records of Sanguinius possessing visions, moments where he glimpsed potential futures and adapted his actions accordingly. Whether these represented genuine precognition or simply tactical intuition, so refined it mimicked foresight, remains unclear. What is certain is that he occasionally acted on information he should not have possessed, making preparations for threats before they manifested, or positioning forces with uncanny precision. This ability, if it truly existed, would have made him even more dangerous in combat, allowing him to anticipate attacks and respond before they fully developed. Some sources suggest he foresaw his own death at Horus's hands, but chose to face that fate regardless, knowing it was necessary for the Emperor's ultimate victory. The genetic legacy Sanguinius passed to his blood angels includes both blessing and curse. His sons inherited his nobility, his pursuit of perfection, and his combat excellence. But they also received the red thirst and the black rage, genetic flaws that speak to darkness lurking beneath his angelic exterior. The red thirst manifests as a literal hunger for blood that can drive blood angels into frenzied states of violence. The black rage is worse, a madness that causes afflicted Marines to relive Sanguinius's final moments, believing they are their Primarch fighting Horus aboard the vengeful spirit. These flaws suggest that even Sanguinius, for all his seeming perfection, carried shadows within him, dark mirrors to his virtues that he kept carefully controlled through force of will. His sacrifice during the Horus heresy elevated him to a position unique even among the Primarchs. The loyalist Primarchs are remembered and honored. But Sanguinius achieved something approaching actual sainthood in imperial consciousness. Churches across the Imperium display his image, his wings spread in protection over the faithful. Guardsmen going into battle pray for the angel's courage. Even Astartes from other chapters acknowledge the special position the great angel occupies in the hierarchy of imperial heroes. His death, far from diminishing his legend, amplified it by transforming him from a merely exceptional warrior into a martyr whose sacrifice helped save humanity itself. When we evaluate Sanguinius among the strongest Primarchs, we must place him at or near the very top in terms of pure combat ability. The consensus among his brothers, both loyal and traitor, was that he was likely the greatest fighter of them all. His victories against entities like Kabanda and his performance against chaos-empowered Horus support this assessment. But his strength went beyond technical skill or raw power. Sanguinius represented something crucial that many of his brothers lacked: the ability to inspire others to exceed their limitations through his example. A Primarch's true might, after all, extends far beyond what he can accomplish with his own hands. It includes what he enables others to achieve, the courage he instills, the hope he represents. By that measure, Sanguinius might have been the strongest of all the Emperor's sons, not despite his compassion and nobility, but because of them. Lion L. Johnson, the first among brothers, the Lion, the first, the son of the forest, the Lord of Caliban. Lion L. Johnson carries these titles and more, each one earned through centuries of warfare that began long before the Emperor found him, and continues to the current age. He is, in many ways, the most enigmatic of the loyalist Primarchs, a figure whose true capabilities and motivations remain clouded in mystery and contradiction. Where Horus wore his charisma openly and Sanguinius radiated nobility that all could perceive, the Lion kept his own counsel, revealing only what he deemed necessary and trusting few with his innermost thoughts. This secretive nature extended to his martial abilities, which observers often underestimated until witnessing them firsthand in combat. Those who survived the experience learned a hard lesson. Lion L. Johnson, was every bit as dangerous as his more obviously powerful brothers. Perhaps more so because opponents rarely understood what they faced until it was too late. His upbringing on Caliban shaped him in ways that separated him from most of his brothers. Where many Primarchs were found and raised by human civilizations that recognized their potential and gave them structure, the Lion spent his earliest years alone in the deep forests of Caliban, surrounded by monsters that would have killed any normal child. The planet's dense woodlands hosted creatures born of chaos corruption, things of tooth and claw and malign intelligence that had hunted humanity since before the Age of Strife. Young Johnson not only survived this environment, but thrived in it, teaching himself to hunt the hunters, to move through the darkness like a wraith, to strike from concealment with lethal precision. By the time the Knights of the Order found him, he had already become something more than merely human, a predator whose instincts had been honed by constant mortal danger. This early experience left its mark on his combat philosophy. Unlike Primarchs, who favored glorious frontal assaults or the pageantry of formal duels, the Lion fought with a pragmatism that sometimes bordered on ruthlessness. He saw battle not as an arena for proving personal valor, but as a problem to be solved through whatever means produced victory most efficiently. If that meant attacking from ambush, exploiting moments of vulnerability, or using terrain to his advantage, he would do so without hesitation. This made him extraordinarily dangerous, because opponents expecting traditional Primarch combat behavior found themselves facing someone who recognized no constraints except effectiveness. His weapons reflected both his hunter's mentality and his role as the Dark Angel's Primarch. The Lion wielded fealty, an exquisite sword whose blade carried the sharpness and balance that only Dark Age technology could provide. In his hands, fealty became an extension of his will, striking with speed and precision that few opponents could match. The blade itself was less ostentatious than some Primarch weapons, lacking the flames of Sanguinius's Encarmine or the thunderfield of Horus's Worldbreaker. But this simplicity was deceptive. A weapon need not announce its deadliness to be lethal, and fealty's understated elegance suited the Lion's approach to warfare perfectly. Every cut was placed exactly where it needed to be. Every thrust carried precisely the force required. No movement wasted on flourish or display. His second signature weapon, the Emperor's Shield, added a defensive capability that complemented his offensive prowess. The shield could erupt in blazing light and force when struck, turning aside blows that would shatter lesser protection. But more than mere defense, the Lion used the shield actively in combat, bashing enemies, creating openings, positioning it to force opponents into disadvantageous angles of attack. In his hands, it became another weapon rather than simply protection, adding to his versatility in ways that made him extremely difficult to pin down tactically. Opponents who tried to overwhelm him with aggression found themselves stymied by his defense. Those who attempted cautious, probing approaches discovered he could suddenly explode into offense, using the shield to create openings his blade could exploit. The Lion's physical capabilities placed him in the upper tier of Primarchs, though perhaps not quite at the absolute peak of pure strength. He was powerful enough to contend with any of his brothers in terms of raw force, but his true advantage lay in how he applied that strength. The Lion moved with a fluidity that belied his size, his centuries fighting monsters in Caliban's forests having taught him economy of motion that wasted no energy. He could maintain a high tempo of combat longer than most opponents, his endurance allowing him to weather initial onslaughts before capitalizing on his enemy's fatigue. This stamina made him particularly dangerous in extended engagements, where the battle became as much about willpower as skill. His duels with other Primarchs provide concrete evidence of his capabilities. The most famous confrontation pits him against his brother Lemon Russ, the Space Wolves Primarch and self-proclaimed executioner. The two had come to blows over tactical disagreements, their different approaches to warfare creating friction that finally erupted into violence. By most accounts, they fought for a day and a night without either gaining clear advantage, their combat so intense that observers feared to intervene. When Russ finally broke away and began to laugh at the absurdity of their situation, the lion, not sharing his brother's sudden mirth, struck him unconscious with a single blow. This victory has been debated endlessly by Imperial scholars. Some claim it proves the lion's superiority. Others argue that Russ was caught off guard, and the strike was thus dishonorable. What seems clear is that the lion, at minimum, matched one of the most physically powerful Primarchs in extended combat, then demonstrated the capacity to end the fight decisively when given an opening. His battles with Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, paint a more complex picture. Kurz was among the most dangerous Primarchs in individual combat, his precognitive abilities allowing him to anticipate attacks before they developed, while his utter lack of moral constraint meant he fought with a savagery few others could match. Their confrontations were brutal affairs that left both Primarchs wounded, the lion sporting a slashed throat while Kurz carried a sword through his back. That they could fight to something approaching a draw speaks to the lion's resilience and skill, but the fact that neither could gain decisive advantage suggests they were relatively evenly matched, despite their vastly different styles. One of the most impressive feats attributed to the lion involves his confrontation with Kairos Fateweaver, a greater demon of Tzeentch, known for its ability to see possible futures and manipulate events through its terrible knowledge. Lesser beings who face such creatures often find themselves outmaneuvered before they even act, their every plan known and countered before they can implement it. The lion, however, seemed remarkably resistant to such manipulation. When Fateweaver attempted to corrupt him with promises of power and revelations of dark secrets, it found nothing in the lion's heart that it could use as leverage. The lion's absolute loyalty to the Emperor, rooted not in expectation of reward, but in its own inherent rightness, provided immunity to temptation. He destroyed the greater demon by impaling it through the heart, reportedly quipping about whether it had seen that coming. The ability to not only resist a greater demon's corruption, but to defeat it in combat, demonstrates capabilities beyond mere physical strength. The lion's tactical genius complemented his personal combat skills in ways that made him one of the most effective Primarchs at actually accomplishing the Imperium's military objectives. Where some brothers fought for glory or pursued personal vendettas, the lion focused relentlessly on victory. He understood warfare as a system where individual battles were simply pieces of larger campaigns, where the appearance of action in one theatre could create opportunities elsewhere. Under his command, the Dark Angels developed a reputation for methodical efficiency, taking worlds and crushing enemies with a precision that left little room for the unexpected. This wasn't the inspirational heroism of Sanguinius or the overwhelming aggression of Angron. It was professional warfare conducted by someone who understood that the Imperium's enemies didn't care about fair fights or noble gestures, only results. His secretive nature, however, created problems that extended beyond battlefield effectiveness. The lion found it difficult to trust even his closest allies, keeping his own counsel to such a degree that it frustrated his brothers and created suspicion about his motives. Some Primarchs wondered if he harbored ambitions to become War Master himself, whether his cooperation stemmed from genuine loyalty or calculated self-interest. These doubts were never resolved because the lion seemed either unwilling or unable to open himself to the sort of camaraderie that bound other Primarchs together. He fought alongside his brothers, coordinated strategies with them, but he never truly let them see the person beneath the title. This isolation, while perhaps protecting him from certain vulnerabilities, also meant he lacked the support networks that sustained other Primarchs through the heresy's darkest moments. The fall of Caliban and the lion's subsequent 10,000-year sleep remain among the most tragic episodes in the Dark Angel's history. When he returned to his homeworld after the heresy, expecting to find it loyal, he instead discovered that Luther and the garrison forces left behind had turned to chaos. The resulting battle devastated the planet. The lion's fury at this betrayal manifesting in orbital bombardment that tore Caliban apart. His final confrontation with Luther, the man who had been his mentor and friend, left both combatants psychically shattered. The lion fell into a coma from which observers believed he might never wake, hidden away by the mysterious watchers in the dark, in chambers beneath the rock, the fragment of Caliban that survived the planet's destruction. His return in the current era of Warhammer 40,000 has proven that the 10 millennia of slumber did not diminish his capabilities. The lion who awakened in the 42nd millennium proved immediately capable of contending with demon Primarchs, his confrontation with Angron, demonstrating that he had lost none of his martial prowess. His ability to traverse the warp-touched realm of Mirror Caliban, appearing where the Dark Angels need him most, adds a new dimension to his effectiveness. He has become something approaching a warp-touched spirit of vengeance, stalking from the shadows to strike at the Imperium's enemies when they least expect it. This combination of timeless skill and new capabilities makes the modern lion arguably even more dangerous than his pre-heresy incarnation. Evaluating the lion's strength requires acknowledging the difference between what he can do and what he chooses to reveal. His secretive nature means that observers rarely see the full extent of his abilities until circumstances force him to deploy them. In pure dueling skill, he ranks at or near the top tier of Primarchs, his swordsmanship rivaling even Sanguinius's, while his tactical flexibility exceeds most of his brothers. His victories over greater daemons and his ability to match brothers like Russ in extended combat demonstrate that his physical capabilities, while perhaps not absolutely supreme, are more than sufficient when combined with his technique and strategic thinking. The lion represents a different kind of strength from the obvious power of Primarchs, like Angron or Vulcan. His is the strength of the apex predator who strikes from unexpected angles, who adapts to counter his opponent's advantages, who treats every battle as a problem to be solved rather than a stage for displaying valor. By that measure, he may be among the most dangerous Primarchs of all, because overconfident enemies rarely realize their peril until his blade has already found their throat. Leman Russ, the Emperor's executioner. Among the Primarchs, Leman Russ of the Space Wolves occupies a unique and somewhat controversial position. He claimed for himself the title of Emperor's executioner, the one Primarch who was supposedly designed and tasked with the specific role of killing his brothers should they turn traitor. This assertion has been debated endlessly by Imperial scholars, some viewing it as self-aggrandizement, while others accept it as truth. What cannot be disputed is that Russ possessed both the capability and the willingness to wage war against his fellow Primarchs when ordered. His assault on Prospero and his confrontation with Magnus the Red, regardless of the circumstances and manipulations that led to it, proved he could and would strike down another son of the Emperor when he believed duty required it. This combination of power, savagery, and absolute loyalty to the Emperor made him one of the most formidable warriors in the Imperium. Russ's combat style drew heavily from his upbringing among the fierce tribes of Fenris, a death world where survival required constant violence against both human enemies and the planet's monstrous wildlife. Unlike many Primarchs who adopted refined techniques or sophisticated strategies, Russ fought with a directness that some mistook for simplicity. He believed in overwhelming force applied with savage precision, in breaking enemies so thoroughly that they could never threaten the Imperium again. This philosophy extended to his own combat approach, where he combined the fury of a berserker with the cunning of a veteran warrior. Opponents who expected mindless aggression found themselves facing something far more dangerous. Calculated violence delivered with such overwhelming force that defense became impossible. His physical power placed him among the strongest Primarchs in terms of pure muscle and bone. Multiple accounts describe Russ performing feats that staggered even other Primarchs. During his confrontation with Magnus on Prospero, he reportedly lifted the Crimson King and broke his back over his knee, despite Magnus using psychic powers to augment his own strength. The fact that Russ could overpower a brother Primarch who was actively resisting with both physical and psychic might speaks to the Wolf King's tremendous capabilities. His strikes carried force sufficient to dent ceramite and shatter bones with simple punches, while his grip could bend metal or crush stone. When Russ unleashed his full strength in combat, few things in the galaxy could withstand him. But raw power alone, while impressive, does not fully explain Russ's effectiveness. He wielded weapons that amplified his natural capabilities in ways that made him even more lethal. The Spear of Russ became particularly significant during the Horus Heresy, a weapon forged by the Emperor himself and imbued with powers specifically designed to harm beings of chaos. When Russ confronted Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit during the Siege of Terra, it was this spear that allowed him to wound the War Master despite the tremendous empowerment Chaos had granted its champion. The fact that Russ, using this sanctified weapon, could penetrate Horus's defenses and inflict genuine damage demonstrates both his skill and the quality of his armament. However, his hesitation at the final moment, his inability to deliver the killing blow to his once beloved brother, speaks to the tragedy that even the Emperor's executioner could not fully overcome his bonds of brotherhood. His tactical approach to warfare emphasized shock and overwhelming aggression. The Space Wolves under Russ's command became known for their savage efficiency in battle, hitting enemies with such force that resistance crumbled before it could organize. Russ believed in breaking enemy morale as thoroughly as destroying their military capability, understanding that defeated foes, who retained hope of resistance, would require additional resources to suppress. His forces conducted themselves with a controlled ferocity that terrified adversaries while remaining disciplined enough to avoid the chaos that afflicted more purely destructive legions. This balance made the Space Wolves one of the most effective legions at pacification operations, able to reduce enemy resistance to rubble while minimizing the resources required for garrison duty afterward. The comparison between Russ and other combat-focused Primarchs reveals interesting patterns. Against Angron, Russ claimed he could have killed his brother if he truly wished, pointing out that while Angron had won their brawl in terms of who was left standing, Russ's Space Wolves had surrounded them and could have ended the encounter at any point. This argument, whether valid or self-serving, highlights a key aspect of Russ's philosophy. Combat should be understood in context, not as isolated tests of martial prowess. A Primarch's strength, in Russ's view, included his ability to leverage resources and position himself advantageously. By that measure, defeating an opponent meant achieving the mission objective, not necessarily proving superiority in single combat. His confrontation with Magnus the Red on Prospero remains one of the most significant and controversial episodes of the heresy. Russ came to the Thousand Sons homeworld believing he was carrying out the Emperor's command to punish Magnus for violating the Edict of Nicaea and dabbling in forbidden sorcery. In truth, Horus had manipulated the orders to turn what should have been an arrest into an extermination campaign. Regardless of the politics surrounding the event, the battle itself demonstrated Russ's capabilities against a brother who possessed overwhelming psychic power. Magnus, even while defending his homeworld and protecting his sons, found himself physically overmatched by Russ. The Wolf King's assault broke through Magnus's defenses, shattered his psychic barriers, and left the Crimson King broken both in body and spirit. This victory over one of the most powerful Primarchs remains controversial because Magnus was fighting while also trying to maintain shields, protecting his legion and his world, potentially limiting his ability to focus his full might on Russ. Nevertheless, the fact remains that Russ succeeded where many other Primarchs would have failed. The question of whether Russ was truly the Emperor's designated executioner of Primarchs has never been definitively answered. He certainly believed it to be true, and his actions during the heresy showed that he possessed both the capacity and the psychological makeup to wage war against his brothers. Unlike Primarchs who might hesitate when facing another son of the Emperor, Russ could set aside his personal feelings when duty required it. This combination of power, ruthlessness, and absolute loyalty made him an ideal weapon for the unpleasant task of policing the other Primarchs. Whether the Emperor actually designated him for this role, or Russ simply adopted it based on his own understanding of his purpose, the practical effect was the same. He was willing and able to do what others might refuse. However, Russ's strength came with corresponding weaknesses that more cunning opponents could exploit. His directness, while effective against most enemies, made him vulnerable to manipulation by those who understood how to frame situations in ways that would trigger his aggressive response. Horus's corruption of the orders regarding Magnus exploited this perfectly, turning Russ's loyalty and sense of duty into weapons that served the traitor cause. Additionally, his savage reputation sometimes created problems in situations requiring diplomatic nuance or careful political maneuvering. Other Primarchs and Imperial officials sometimes viewed him as a blunt instrument, useful for smashing enemies, but unsuited for more complex operations. This perception, while not entirely fair, limited his influence in councils and planning sessions where his perspective might have been valuable. His combat abilities during the heresy's later stages showed both growth and limitation. When he engaged Horus, Russ demonstrated that he had learned from his earlier encounters, fighting with a combination of fury and caution that served him well against a vastly empowered opponent. But even wielding the spear of Russ and fighting with everything he possessed, he could not overcome chaos-empowered Horus. The fact that he wounded the War Master and briefly purged some of his corruption represents a victory of sorts, but Russ ultimately failed in his attempt to kill Horus and suffered grievous wounds in the process. This defeat, more than anything else in his career, highlighted the limits of even the Emperor's executioner when facing enemies who had sacrificed their humanity for power beyond mortal capacity. His disappearance after the heresy, like that of several other Primarchs, has left the Space Wolves waiting for his return during what they believe will be the Imperium's darkest hour. Russ reportedly departed on a quest into the Eye of Terror, seeking something that he believed would help the Imperium in future conflicts. Whether he survived what he found, and whether he will ever return, remain questions that 10,000 years have not answered. Some believe he became lost in the warp, others that he still fights within the Eye, waging a one-man war against chaos that has continued for millennia. A few even whisper that he has returned in secret, walking among the Imperium in disguise while preparing for a future revelation. Whatever the truth, his absence has left the Space Wolves without their Primarch's guidance for longer than they had him during the Great Crusade and Heresy combined. Evaluating Russ's strength requires us to consider multiple factors beyond simple combat ability. In terms of pure physical power, he ranks at or near the top of all Primarchs, his strength exceeding even most of his extraordinarily powerful brothers. His victories against Magnus and his ability to wound Horus prove that his combat capabilities were genuinely exceptional, not merely propaganda from his legion. However, his effectiveness was sometimes limited by his straightforward approach to problem-solving and his vulnerability to manipulation by more subtle enemies. The Emperor's executioner was a devastating weapon when pointed at the right target, but determining which targets truly threatened the Imperium required wisdom that Russ didn't always possess. Nevertheless, in a galaxy where strength often determines survival, Russ's combination of power, ferocity, and absolute conviction made him one of the most dangerous warriors humanity ever produced. Reboot Guilliman, the Avenging Sun, returns. In an age where most of the Emperor's sons are legends from a bygone era or corrupted monsters serving the dark gods, Reboot Guilliman stands unique as one of only 2 loyalist Primarchs confirmed to be active in the current millennium. His return from 10,000 years of stasis has provided the Imperium with something it desperately needed: a general with the vision and capability to coordinate resistance against threats that multiply faster than they can be contained. Guilliman was never the most obviously powerful Primarch in terms of raw combat ability or psychic might. What made him exceptional was his comprehensiveness, his ability to excel in multiple domains that other Primarchs neglected in favor of their specialties. This versatility, combined with his organizational genius and strategic vision, makes him arguably the most valuable Primarch to the Imperium's current situation, even if not the absolute strongest in individual combat. Guilliman's approach to warfare emphasized preparation, logistics, and systematic execution over the glorious but unsustainable heroics favored by some of his brothers. He understood that wars were won not just through battlefield victories, but through the infrastructure that enabled armies to fight, the supply lines that kept them equipped, the training regimes that maintained their effectiveness. While other Primarchs might win spectacular individual battles, Guilliman built the systems that won campaigns and secured conquests. His Codex Astartes, the comprehensive manual for space marine organization and tactics, has shaped Imperial military doctrine for 10 millennia. This intellectual legacy represents a form of strength that transcends physical power, ensuring that even in his absence, his strategic philosophy continued to guide humanity's defenders. His physical capabilities, while impressive by any standard other than his brothers, placed him somewhere in the middle tier of Primarchs in terms of raw strength and speed. He could not match Vulcan's incredible resilience, Russ's overwhelming power, or Sanguinius's preternatural grace. What he could do was maintain consistent effectiveness across extended campaigns where fatigue, injury, and exhaustion would degrade the performance of more specialized fighters. Guilliman fought with a technical precision that emphasized efficiency over flourish. His movements calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum wasted energy. This approach made him extremely dangerous in extended engagements where battles stretched across days or weeks, as he could maintain a high level of combat effectiveness long after more aggressive fighters had exhausted themselves. His signature weapon, the Hand of Dominion, is a power fist of exceptional craftsmanship that can crush armored vehicles and shatter fortifications. Paired with the Emperor's sword, a blade that burns with the Emperor's own power, and that he now wields in the current era, Guilliman possesses both devastating melee capability and the means to harm even demonic entities that would normally require blessed weapons to damage. The synergy between these weapons allows him to adapt to different combat situations, using the sword when facing supernatural threats or opponents where its holy fire proves particularly effective, while relying on the power fist against more physically resilient enemies or structures. His encounters with other Primarchs during the heresy provide concrete evidence of his combat capabilities. When Lorgar and Angron ambushed him on New Syria, Guilliman found himself facing two traitor Primarchs simultaneously, both empowered by chaos. He managed to wound Lorgar badly enough to drive him from the battle, demonstrating that even against a psychically gifted opponent who had embraced the dark gods, Guilliman's combat skills remained formidable. Against Angron, now transformed into a demon Primarch of Khorne, Guilliman fought desperately but found himself overmatched. Daemon Princes represent a different order of threat from regular Primarchs, their power amplified by warp energies to levels that transcend physical limitations. The fact that Guilliman survived the encounter and escaped, rather than being torn apart by the Red Angel's fury, speaks to his resilience and tactical awareness even in the worst circumstances. His survival through the heresy resulted more from strategic intelligence than invincible combat prowess. Guilliman understood when to engage and when to withdraw, when to stand firm, and when flexibility would better serve the larger strategic picture. This wisdom, which some of his more glory-focused brothers lacked, kept him alive through circumstances that might have killed more reckless Primarchs. When Fulgrim attacked him with a poisoned blade, nearly killing him, Guilliman's life was saved by quick intervention from his apothecaries rather than his own combat ability. The fact that he was vulnerable to such attacks, unlike brothers with supernatural resilience or precognitive abilities, highlights that he relied more on skill and preparation than inherent invulnerability. His 10,000-year slumber in stasis, suspended between life and death by the technology of the armor of fate and the prayers of ultramarines who never stopped hoping for his recovery, ended only when Belisarius Cawl and Cypher managed to bring him before the Emperor's presence. His revival came at a crucial moment when the Imperium teetered on the brink of collapse. assaulted from all sides by enemies that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. The Primarch who awakened was somewhat changed by his experience, bearing not just the physical scars of his near death, but a perspective shaped by witnessing what his Imperium had become during his absence. The noble vision he had fought to build had devolved into a theocratic nightmare where the Emperor was worshipped as a god, where innovation was viewed with suspicion, where hope had been replaced by grim determination to survive one more day. This knowledge might have broken someone else. Instead, it galvanized Guilliman to begin the monumental task of reforming the Imperium, even while fighting to preserve it. His modern combat capabilities, enhanced by the Emperor's sword and the wisdom of 10,000 years of Imperial experience to draw upon, make him more formidable than his heresy-era incarnation. When Magnus the Red confronted him in the current era, attempting to use Guilliman as an unwitting pawn to infiltrate Terra's webway gate, the battle showcased both Guilliman's strengths and his limitations. Magnus, as a demon Primarch, and perhaps the greatest psyker among the Emperor's sons, possessed powers that should have utterly overwhelmed a Primarch who lacked significant psychic abilities. Indeed, Magnus brought Guilliman to the verge of death, his sorcery proving more than a match for even Primarch-level resilience. But Guilliman's tactical awareness saved him. By luring Magnus to a dormant gate on Luna rather than Terra, he ensured that reinforcements could arrive in time. The intervention of Imperial Fists, Adeptus Custodes, and crucially the Sisters of Silence, whose blank presence nullified Magnus's psychic advantage, allowed Guilliman to turn the tide. With Magnus's powers suppressed, Guilliman's superior melee combat skills proved decisive, and he managed to drive the demon Primarch back through the webway. This battle illustrates a crucial aspect of Guilliman's strength, his ability to create advantageous situations through strategic thinking. He might not be able to defeat Magnus in a fair fight in an empty room, but he ensured through planning and positioning that he never had to. By leveraging resources, coordinating forces, and understanding his own limitations, he achieved victories that might have been impossible through raw power alone. This adaptability, this willingness to use every advantage rather than relying solely on personal prowess, makes him exceptionally dangerous to opponents who view warfare as a series of individual duels rather than a complex system of interconnected factors. His leadership of the Indomitus Crusade has demonstrated how a Primarch's strength extends far beyond personal combat. Guilliman has coordinated military operations across an entire galaxy, reinforcing beleaguered systems, establishing new supply routes, and attempting to restore some measure of order to the Imperium's fractured territories. While other Primarchs might achieve more spectacular individual victories, none of them possessed Guilliman's combination of administrative genius, strategic vision, and logistical expertise. He has overseen the deployment of Primaris Space Marines, reformed outdated military protocols, and attempted to introduce at least modest improvements to the Imperium's stagnant bureaucracy. These accomplishments, while less dramatic than slaying greater demons or dueling other Primarchs, represent a form of strength that has potentially saved billions of lives and preserved countless worlds that would otherwise have fallen to the Imperium's enemies. His relationship with the current Imperium is complex and often frustrating. The religious dogma that surrounds the Emperor prevents Guilliman from implementing reforms he knows are necessary. The ecclesiarchy views him with suspicion, unsure whether to revere him as a living saint or fear him as a potential usurper. Political factions within the Imperium attempt to use his authority to advance their own agendas, creating conflicts that distract from the actual work of defending humanity. Through it all, Guilliman maintains his focus on the practical tasks at hand, understanding that the perfect is the enemy of the good and that incremental improvements are better than catastrophic attempts at complete reformation. This pragmatism, born of hard experience and wisdom earned over centuries, represents a maturity that many of his brothers never achieved. Evaluating Guilliman's strength requires acknowledging that his greatest assets were never the ability to crack planets with his fists or rend reality with psychic might. His power lies in his comprehensive capabilities, his ability to fight effectively while also planning campaigns, organizing logistics, writing doctrine, training forces, and managing the countless details that determine whether wars are won or lost. In terms of pure combat ability, he ranks perhaps 5th to 8th among the Primarchs, capable of holding his own against most opponents, but not dominant over the very top-tier fighters like Sanguinius, Horus, or the Lion. However, when we measure strength by overall contribution to the Imperium's survival and success, Guilliman might rank at or near the top. His combination of competent martial skill and exceptional strategic thinking makes him the rare Primarch who can both fight on the front lines and effectively command the war's entire scope. In the current age, where the Imperium desperately needs both a warrior and an administrator, Guilliman's balanced excellence makes him possibly the most valuable asset humanity possesses. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King's psychic dominion. Among all the Emperor's sons, Magnus the Red represented humanity's greatest potential and most tragic failure in understanding and wielding the powers of the warp. His psychic abilities exceeded those of every other Primarch, rivaling even the Emperor's own mastery of the Imperium. Where other brothers wielded force of arms or tactical genius, Magnus commanded reality itself, bending the laws of physics to his will and perceiving truths that remained hidden from purely material senses. This power made him simultaneously one of the most formidable Primarchs in the right circumstances and one of the most vulnerable when those circumstances turned against him. His story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing knowledge without heeding the warnings of those who understand its costs, and about how even the mightiest can be manipulated by forces they believe they control. Magnus's physical form reflected his unique nature. He stood among the tallest of his brothers, his copper-red skin marking him as different from birth. His single eye, the result of a bargain with Tzeentch that he didn't fully understand at the time, could perceive across multiple spectra simultaneously, seeing not just visible light but psychic energies, emotional resonances, and the currents of fate that flowed through the warp. His body was less fixed than those of his brothers, his form sometimes seeming to shift subtly, as if it existed partially out of phase with normal reality. This quasi-physical nature would become even more pronounced after his transformation into a demon Primarch. But even before his fall, he was something other than purely material. His psychic capabilities defied easy categorization because they operated on a scale that made comparison with other psychers almost meaningless. Magnus could teleport himself halfway across the galaxy through sheer force of will, an act that should have been impossible for any being not directly empowered by one of the Chaos Gods. He could perceive events occurring on distant worlds through the warp, his consciousness ranging across space in ways that gave him intelligence advantages no purely physical observer could match. In combat, he could amplify his physical strength to match or exceed that of brothers like Vulcan or Ferrus Manus. Or he could transmute matter with a thought, turning an opponent's weapon to glass or their armor to acid. The versatility of his powers meant that opponents never knew quite what they would face when engaging him. However, this immense psychic might came with corresponding vulnerabilities that his physical nature could not compensate for. Magnus's body, while imposing in size and strength, lacked the innate resilience of brothers who had been designed more for direct combat. Without his psychic powers to enhance him, Magnus was competent but not exceptional in melee. His reflexes, speed, and raw physical strength fell below the top tier of Primarchs. This meant that opponents who could nullify or resist his psychic abilities had a significant advantage, turning what should be an engagement against a demigod into something more approaching a duel between merely superhuman warriors. This weakness would prove critical during several key confrontations in his history. The Sisters of Silence represented perhaps the greatest threat to Magnus because their blank presence actively cancelled psychic abilities in their vicinity. A squad of these null maidens could reduce Magnus from a godlike sorcerer to something far more vulnerable, stripping away the powers that made him one of the strongest Primarchs and leaving him to fight on purely physical terms, where he was outmatched by many of his brothers. This vulnerability extended to psychosuppression technology and wards that other Primarchs could largely ignore. Where someone like Russ or Gilliman would be mildly inconvenienced by anti-psycho measures, Magnus could be rendered almost helpless. His greatest strength turned into a liability. His tactical approach to warfare reflected his strengths and preferences. Magnus favored diplomatic solutions when possible, believing that many conflicts could be resolved through negotiation rather than violence. When force became necessary, he wielded his legion's psychic might like a scalpel, targeting enemy leadership and critical infrastructure with precision strikes that achieved objectives with minimal collateral damage. This approach made him extraordinarily efficient at compliance operations, where the goal was to bring worlds into Imperial service rather than simply destroying opposition. However, it also sometimes led to complications when enemy populations, particularly those familiar with chaos corruption, viewed his legion's psychic abilities with fear and revulsion rather than awe. His greatest feat and greatest failure occurred when he attempted to warn the Emperor about Horus's betrayal. Discovering through his psychic sight that the War Master had turned traitor, Magnus sought to alert his father immediately despite the Emperor's edict banning psychic communication at the Council of Nicaea. Rather than using conventional methods that would take too long, Magnus tore through the warp itself to project his consciousness directly into the Emperor's throne room on Terra. This act of desperation succeeded in delivering the warning, but had catastrophic unintended consequences. Magnus's psychic breach shattered the wards the Emperor had carefully maintained around his secret webway project, allowing demons to pour into the network of tunnels he had been constructing beneath Terra. The damage Magnus caused in a single moment of well-intentioned violation doomed the Emperor's plan to free humanity from dependence on warp travel, forcing him to personally hold the breach closed while his empire burned. The consequences of this disaster extended beyond merely physical damage. The Emperor, enraged by Magnus's destruction of his work and violation of his explicit commands, ordered Leman Russ to bring Magnus to account. Through Horus's manipulation, this order was corrupted from arrest to annihilation, turning the Space Wolves into executioners rather than marshals. When Russ arrived at Prospero with his fleet, Magnus was paralyzed by guilt and shame, believing he deserved whatever punishment came. He forbade his 1,000 sons from preparing significant defenses, ordering them to accept their fate. This decision meant that when the assault began, the 1,000 sons were caught unprepared to face one of the most aggressive legions in the Imperium. The burning of Prospero showcased both Magnus's tremendous power and his fatal vulnerabilities. When he finally engaged Russ in battle, attempting to defend what remained of his world and his legion, Magnus wielded psychic might that should have overwhelmed the Wolf King. He transmuted matter, hurled psychic lightning, attempted to crush Russ with telekinetic force. But Russ, protected by the Spear of Russ and accompanied by Sisters of Silence whose blank presence suppressed Magnus's abilities, proved able to counter the psychic assault. Their confrontation ended with Russ breaking Magnus's back over his knee, a physical demonstration of dominance that shattered the Crimson King both literally and spiritually. Only intervention from Tzeentch saved Magnus from permanent death, the Dark God claiming his soul and elevating him to daemonhood as the price of survival. His transformation into a daemon Primarch fundamentally altered Magnus's nature. The being who emerged on the planet of sorcerers was immensely more powerful than his mortal incarnation, but also fundamentally compromised. Demon Primarchs trade independence for power, becoming bound to the Chaos Gods who elevate them in ways that make them effectively slaves dressed in the trappings of divinity. Magnus gained abilities that allowed him to contend with entities that would have destroyed his mortal form, his sorcery amplified to such heights that he could threaten entire worlds with his will alone. He grew to titanic size, sprouted wings that could carry him through the warp itself, and became nearly impossible to permanently kill through conventional means. However, this power came at the cost of everything that had made Magnus who he was. His quest for knowledge had been corrupted into service to Tzeentch's endless schemes. His pride in his legion's accomplishments had been tainted by the knowledge that his own mistakes had led to their transformation into dust-filled suits of armor. His relationship with his father, always complex, had devolved into bitter enmity, where once there had been hope for reconciliation. The Magnus who served chaos was more powerful than the Magnus who served the Emperor, but he was also less free, bound by invisible chains to a master whose goals he no longer fully understood or controlled. His battles during the Siege of Terror demonstrated the heights and depths of his transformed state. Magnus wielded psychic might that threatened to unravel the Emperor's defenses, his sorcery eating away at the wards that prevented demons from manifesting directly on the throne world. But when confronted by opponents who could resist his powers, he struggled. His engagement with Vulcan in the Imperial dungeon showed that even as a demon Primarch, he could be overwhelmed by a determined opponent who wouldn't stay dead. Vulcan's perpetual nature meant that Magnus's attempts to kill him through beheading, suffocation, blood drain, or immolation all failed. The Salamander's Primarch kept regenerating and attacking, his hammer blows gradually wearing down Magnus's psychic barriers until the Crimson King had to abandon his physical form and flee as pure warp energy. His confrontation with Guilliman in the current era provides another data point about Magnus's capabilities and limitations. As a daemon Primarch fighting a mortal Primarch who lacked significant psychic abilities, Magnus should have achieved an easy victory. Indeed, he brought Guilliman to the brink of death, his sorcery overwhelming the Avenging Sun's defenses and leaving him vulnerable. But Guilliman's strategic thinking turned the battle. By luring Magnus to Luna and ensuring the Sisters of Silence were present, he created conditions where Magnus's greatest strength became liability. With his psychic powers suppressed by the blanks, Magnus found himself in a purely physical confrontation with a Primarch, who, while not the strongest fighter, was more than capable of defeating a Magnus rendered vulnerable. The result was a clear victory for Guilliman and a retreat for Magnus through the webway. These defeats highlight a consistent pattern in Magnus's story. His tremendous psychic power makes him nearly unstoppable under ideal conditions. But when those conditions are disrupted, he lacks fallback options that other Primarchs possess. A warrior like Russ or Angron remains dangerous even when wounded, tired, and disadvantaged, because their physical capabilities don't depend on external factors. Magnus, stripped of his psychic might by blanks or wards, becomes markedly less threatening. This makes him simultaneously one of the strongest and one of the most counterable Primarchs, depending entirely on the circumstances of engagement. Evaluating Magnus's strength requires us to specify context. In an environment where he can freely employ his psychic abilities, Magnus ranks at or near the absolute top of all Primarchs. His power exceeds that of any other son of the Emperor, save possibly chaos-empowered Horus, and his versatility makes him extremely difficult to counter without specialized assets. He could likely defeat most of his brothers in single combat under ideal conditions, overwhelming them with sorcery before they could close to melee range. However, in environments where psychic abilities are suppressed or against opponents with anti-psychic capabilities, Magnus drops significantly in effectiveness. His physical prowess alone places him perhaps in the bottom third of Primarchs in close combat. This extreme variability makes Magnus unique among the Emperor's sons, a being of godlike power in one context and relative vulnerability in another. Vulcan, the undying lord of drakes. In discussions of which Primarch possessed the greatest physical strength, one name emerges repeatedly with near universal agreement: Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamander's Legion, was simply stronger than his brothers in terms of pure muscular power. Multiple Primarchs confirmed this assessment through personal observation and, in some cases, painful experience. He stood taller than most of his brothers, his frame packed with muscle that seemed almost too dense for his already imposing form, but his strength extended beyond mere physical might. Vulcan possessed a resilience that transcended normal Primarch durability, an ability to endure punishment that would destroy others and return from injuries that should have been fatal. This combination of overwhelming power and supernatural endurance made him one of the most difficult Primarchs to actually defeat in any permanent sense. Vulcan's unique nature stemmed from a trait he shared with the Emperor himself. He was a perpetual, a rare human mutation that granted him functional immortality. Perpetuals possess the ability to regenerate from any injury, no matter how severe, and return from death itself given sufficient time. This meant that Vulcan could survive wounds that would permanently kill his brothers. He could be beheaded, immolated, crushed, poisoned, or subjected to any form of execution imaginable, and he would eventually regenerate to fight again. This capacity transformed the calculus of fighting him, because defeating Vulcan in battle didn't necessarily mean defeating him permanently. Opponents had to not just wound him severely enough to incapacitate him, but then either permanently contain him or destroy him in ways that even perpetual regeneration couldn't overcome. The proof of his regenerative abilities came through terrible experience. During the Horus Heresy, Conrad Kersey captured Vulcan after the drop site massacre on Istvan V. The Night Haunter, a sadistic psychopath who took pleasure in torture, spent months attempting to break both Vulcan's body and mind. Kersey killed Vulcan repeatedly in various ways, believing each time that he had succeeded in permanently ending his brother. He personally beheaded him, ripped out his throat with eating utensils, stabbed him through the chest, and dismembered him. Separately, he had Vulcan eviscerated, shot with hundreds of bolt rounds at point-blank range, ejected from a starship's engine while it was firing, and thrown naked into the vacuum of space. Each time, after Kersey had moved on believing Vulcan finally dead, the Salamander's Primarch regenerated and resumed consciousness. This extended torture had its intended psychological effect, leaving Vulcan traumatized in ways that would persist even after his escape. But it also definitively proved that he was effectively impossible to kill through conventional means. His final death during the heresy required something extraordinary: fulgurite, a petrified bolt of the Emperor's own psychic power preserved in crystalline form. John Grammaticus, a perpetual himself working for the mysterious alien cabal, stabbed Vulcan through the heart with a piece of fulgurite. The psychic backlash killed both of them, though Grammaticus regenerated for what he knew would be his final life. Vulcan, however, appeared to be truly dead, his body recovered by his brothers and placed in a stasis casket crafted by Guilliman. The Salamanders who survived believed their Primarch had finally passed beyond recovery. But later, in the depths of terror during the Emperor's work in the Imperial dungeon, Vulcan emerged alive once more, having somehow regenerated even from a wound that should have permanently ended him. His combat capabilities extended far beyond simple durability. Vulcan could lift and throw objects that should have required heavy machinery to move. Accounts describe him flipping predator tanks, which weigh approximately 50 tons, with his bare hands. He could generate striking force sufficient to cave in power armor with simple punches, and his grip strength allowed him to bend metal or crush stone without apparent effort. When he wielded his signature weapons, the Warhammer Dawnbringer, or the bolter known as the Furnace's Heart, that strength translated into attacks that could shatter fortifications and destroy armored vehicles. A blow from Dawnbringer carried force that could pulverize concrete and send shockwaves through nearby structures. His fighting style reflected his craftsman's nature. Vulcan fought with methodical precision, his movements economical and purposeful, rather than flashy or excessive. He understood the principle of applying force exactly where and when it would achieve maximum effect, the same philosophy that guided his legendary craftsmanship. Each strike was placed deliberately, each defense positioned to minimize the energy required to turn aside attacks. This efficiency meant that Vulcan could sustain combat effectiveness far longer than more aggressive fighters who burned through their endurance in furious charges. In extended engagements, Vulcan's combination of strength, endurance, and technical skill made him nearly unstoppable, as opponents gradually wore down while he remained fresh. However, pure physical might does not automatically translate to combat supremacy, as Vulcan himself would discover. Despite his strength advantage and his supernatural resilience, he was not invincible in battle against certain opponents. During his confrontation with Magnus in the Imperial dungeon, Vulcan's task was to prevent the Crimson King from completing a ritual that would aid the traitor forces. Magnus wielded psychic powers that could directly harm Vulcan, regardless of his physical toughness, beheading him with sorcerous blades, transmuting his lungs to amber to suffocate him, draining his blood with warpcraft, and immolating him with psychic fire. Each time Magnus killed him, Vulcan regenerated and resumed his assault, his perpetual nature turning what should have been a one-sided slaughter into a war of attrition. Eventually, Magnus's desperation grew as he realized he couldn't permanently eliminate his brother, and his attempts to complete his ritual were constantly interrupted by Vulcan's relentless attacks. The Crimson King was forced to give himself wholly to chaos to escape, ascending to demonhood and being expelled from the Imperial dungeon by its anti-demonic wards. This battle illustrates both Vulcan's strengths and his limitations. His perpetual nature meant that even Magnus, one of the most powerful Primarchs, could not permanently defeat him through conventional means. But Magnus repeatedly killed Vulcan in their engagement, demonstrating that Vulcan's durability had limits that could be temporarily exceeded. Against opponents with sufficient power or esoteric abilities, Vulcan could be beaten in individual exchanges, even if those victories didn't stick. His regeneration bought him time and opportunities, but didn't prevent him from experiencing injury and temporary incapacitation. His compassion and humanity, traits unusual among Primarchs, provided both strength and vulnerability. Vulcan genuinely cared about the welfare of common humans in ways that most of his brothers did not. He understood that the Imperium existed to serve humanity rather than the other way around, and he endeavored to minimize civilian casualties and collateral damage in his campaigns. This empathy made him beloved by his salamanders and respected by the Imperial forces he worked alongside. But it also sometimes created hesitation in situations where ruthless action might have been more effective. When he had the opportunity to kill Magnus during their battle in the Imperial dungeon, even hearing the Emperor's own voice commanding him to do so, Vulcan hesitated. That moment of mercy, born from his inability to strike down a brother, even one who had fallen to corruption, allowed Magnus to escape. A more ruthless Primarch might not have paused. His craftsmanship represented another form of strength that extended beyond the battlefield. Vulcan was perhaps the greatest artificer among the Primarchs, able to create weapons and tools of exceptional quality that enhanced the capabilities of those who wielded them. Dawnbringer, his warhammer, was powerful enough to serve as a Primarch's weapon, yet balanced well enough for precise work. The various artifacts he created and scattered across the galaxy, intended as tests for his salamanders, demonstrated mastery of technologies that even the Mechanicum struggled to replicate. This ability to craft superior equipment meant that Vulcan's influence extended beyond what he personally accomplished, as his works empowered others to achieve victories they couldn't have claimed with lesser tools. His departure from the Imperium, roughly 1,000 years after the heresy, remains shrouded in mystery. Vulcan claimed he would return when his legion had found all 9 artifacts he had hidden across the galaxy, tests to prove they were worthy of his leadership. He then disappeared, leaving the salamanders to wonder whether their Primarch still lived somewhere in the Imperium's vastness, had ventured beyond its borders, or had entered some form of voluntary seclusion. 10,000 years later, his fate remains unknown. The salamanders continue to search for the artifacts, believing that completing this quest will summon their Primarch back to lead them in what they perceive will be humanity's darkest hour. Whether Vulcan lives, where he might be, and whether he will ever return are questions that time has not answered. Evaluating Vulcan's strength requires acknowledging his unique position among the Primarchs. In terms of pure physical power, he exceeded all his brothers, his strength sufficient to perform feats that even other Primarchs found impressive. His perpetual nature made him effectively impossible to permanently kill, an advantage no other Primarch possessed. However, his combat skills, while excellent, did not quite reach the heights of supreme duelists like Sanguinius or the Lion. Opponents with sufficient power could defeat him in individual exchanges, though those victories rarely mattered in the long term, given his regenerative abilities. His true strength lay in his comprehensiveness. Exceptional physical power, supernatural endurance, skilled craftsmanship, and genuine nobility of character. This combination made him not just a powerful warrior, but a complete Primarch, embodying multiple aspects of what the Emperor had hoped to create in his sons. Among the Loyalists, few could claim to be as wholly admirable as Vulcan, the Promethean giant, whose strength was matched only by his humanity. Angron, the Red Angel's endless fury. If Sanguinius represented the ideal of what a warrior could become through discipline and nobility, Angron represented the opposite end of that spectrum, a being whose entire existence had been reduced to violence and rage, all higher thought subordinated to the desperate need to kill. The tragedy of Angron was that he was not created to be a mindless berserker. He was meant to be something far more complex, a warrior with empathy so deep that he could literally feel the emotions of those around him. But the butcher's nails, the archaeotech implants forced into his brain by his captors on his hellish homeworld of New Syria, lobotomized away the portions of his mind that might have made him great and replaced them with neural architecture designed solely to reward violence. The Primarch who emerged from this brutal modification was perhaps the most lethal close combat fighter among the Emperor's sons, but he was also a tragic figure whose potential had been stolen before he could ever realize it. Angron's physical capabilities before his transformation into a demon prince placed him among the strongest Primarchs in terms of raw combat effectiveness. His was not the refined skill of Sanguinius or the tactical precision of the Lion. Instead, Angron fought with a barely controlled fury that turned him into a living weapon, a whirlwind of axes and chain teeth that carved through anything in reach. The butcher's nails drove him to constant aggression, rewarding him with pleasure when he killed, and punishing him with excruciating pain when he wasn't fighting. This neurological programming made him perhaps the most relentless Primarch in battle, because stopping to rest or consider tactics caused him physical agony. He simply charged forward, killing until no enemies remained, or until his body could no longer sustain him. His weapons reflected his brutal fighting style. Angron wielded twin chain axes, Gorechild and Gorefather, weapons whose roaring teeth could shred ceramite and tear through flesh with equal efficiency. Unlike elegant Primarch weapons that represented artistry as much as functionality, Angron's axes were simply efficient at one task: killing. He swung them with such speed and force that defensive maneuvers became nearly impossible. Opponents found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer volume of attacks coming from unpredictable angles, each blow carrying enough power to split armor or sever limbs. Block one attack, and 3 more would follow before defenses could reset. Trying to create distance simply meant dying tired instead of dying quickly. As Angron's aggression never diminished, and his pain-driven fury allowed him to ignore wounds that would slow other fighters. His most famous confrontation with another Primarch occurred when he fought Leman Russ on an unnamed world during the Great Crusade. The Space Wolves Primarch and the World Eaters Primarch had clashed over philosophical differences regarding the proper conduct of war, their disagreement escalating into physical violence. By most accounts, Angron won the actual fight, his berserker fury eventually overwhelming Russ's considerable combat abilities. The Wolf King found himself on his back with Angron standing over him, but Russ then pointed out that his space wolves had surrounded them during the battle, their bolters trained on Angron, and could have ended the World Eater's Primarch at any point. Russ's argument was that true victory meant achieving objectives, not merely winning individual combat, and that Angron's single-minded focus on personal violence made him tactically blind. Whether this represents a genuine philosophical point or simply face-saving after a defeat depends on one's perspective, but the fact remains that Angron had bested one of the most powerful Primarchs in direct combat. However, Angron's strengths came with crippling weaknesses that limited his effectiveness as a Primarch. His constant aggression made him predictable. Enemies who could weather his initial fury or create situations where his mindless assault put him at disadvantage could exploit his inability to adapt. His tactical thinking, never his strong suit and increasingly compromised by the butcher's nails, deteriorated to the point where he sometimes made decisions that undermined his own force's effectiveness. The World Eaters under his command became increasingly characterized by their suicidal charges, throwing themselves at enemies with Angron-like fury, but without coordination or strategic purpose. This made them terrifying on an individual level, but less effective as a military force compared to more disciplined legions. His transformation into a demon prince of Khorne during the fighting on Nuceria elevated his raw combat power to terrifying new heights, but also completed his reduction to a weapon devoid of any higher purpose. When Lorga orchestrated the ritual that sacrificed millions to transform Angron, he created a being of such overwhelming violence that even other demon princes gave him wide berth. Demon Prince Angron grew to immense size, his frame swollen with muscle powered by warp energies. He sprouted wings that allowed him to take to the air like his brother Sanguinius, but where the angel used flight for tactical advantage, Angron used it simply to reach enemies more quickly. His skin became armored with brass, blessed by Khorne with resilience that made him nearly impervious to conventional weapons. His axes burned with hellfire and grew to sizes that could cleave titans in half. He became, quite literally, a god of murder. His confrontation with Sanguinius during the Siege of Terra showcased both his demonic power and his fundamental nature as a weapon without subtlety. The two Primarchs fought in the sky above Terra, their aerial battle drawing the attention of millions below. Angron's demon prince form should have given him overwhelming advantage. He was larger, stronger, and empowered by one of the Chaos gods themselves. But Sanguinius fought with a skill and grace that Angron could not match, even with his amplified abilities. The battle raged until Angron managed to impale Sanguinius on his black blade, a blow that should have ended the angel. Instead, Sanguinius used the moment of contact to tear the butcher's nails from Angron's skull, ripping free the implants that had defined his existence for so long. The psychic backlash caused Angron's head to explode, banishing the demon prince back to the warp. That Sanguinius could defeat empowered Angron while wounded demonstrates both the angel's exceptional skill and Angron's reliance on raw power over technique. The modern Angron who has returned to the material realm remains one of the most dangerous entities in the galaxy. He leads his World Eaters in campaigns of destruction across Imperial space, his presence alone enough to drive mortals insane with the psychic pressure of his fury. When he manifests physically, entire regiments break and run rather than face him. Space Marines who would stand firm against any conventional enemy have been known to falter when Demon Prince Angron strides toward them, radiating an aura of pure violence that bypasses reason and triggers primal fear responses. He has single-handedly destroyed Titans, ripped apart fortifications, and carved through Space Marine companies like they were unarmored conscripts. His combat power in this form likely exceeds that of any other Primarch save possibly Chaos-empowered Horus. However, this power comes at a cost that extends beyond the merely moral or spiritual. Demon princes are slaves to the gods who elevate them, their actions ultimately serving the dark power's goals rather than their own. Angron has become Khorne's attack dog, unleashed to kill but never truly free to choose his own path. The empathy he might once have possessed, before the nails destroyed it, is completely gone. The potential for greatness that the Emperor designed into him has been utterly wasted, transformed into something that exists solely to generate corpses. He is perhaps the ultimate example of tragedy among the Primarchs, a being who never had a chance to be what he might have been, whose entire existence was defined by pain and the desperate attempts to escape that pain through violence. His battles with other Primarchs in the current era demonstrate his capabilities and limitations. When the lion confronted him in the Wormwood during the Battle of Idolatros, freshly awakened from his 10,000-year slumber, the first Primarch proved capable of holding his own against the demon prince. The lion's combination of skill, the Emperor's shield, and the holy blade fealty allowed him to counter Angron's overwhelming aggression with precision and technique. The fight ended inconclusively, with neither combatant gaining clear victory before circumstances separated them. But the fact that the lion survived and even drove Angron back suggests that raw power alone, no matter how immense, cannot overcome all opponents. Similarly, his regular confrontations with the forces of the Imperium, while usually resulting in victories for the World Eaters, have not allowed him to achieve strategic objectives that would truly threaten imperial stability. Angron can destroy any force sent against him, but he cannot hold territory, organize conquests, or build anything lasting. He is pure destruction without purpose, a weapon that can demolish but never create. By the standards that measure Primarchs as builders of empire and architects of humanity's future, Angron has failed completely. By the narrower standard of personal combat ability, however, he ranks at or near the absolute top, particularly in his demon prince form. Evaluating Angron's strength requires us to specify which version we're discussing and what criteria we use. Pre-demon Angron was extraordinarily dangerous in close combat, likely capable of defeating most of his brothers through sheer relentless aggression. His victories over Russ and his ability to hold his own against other powerful Primarchs support this assessment. However, his tactical limitations and predictability meant that opponents who could survive his initial fury or trap him in disadvantageous situations could potentially overcome him. Post-demon Angron represents a different category of threat entirely, a being whose power exceeds nearly any opponent he might face. In terms of pure killing capacity, modern Angron might be the single most dangerous Primarch. But his complete enslavement to Khorne and his inability to contribute anything beyond violence mean that, by any comprehensive measure of what makes a Primarch valuable or strong, he represents a tragic failure. He is the Emperor's son, reduced to a weapon, powerful but ultimately purposeless, deadly but doomed to never be anything more than what others made him. Fulgrim, Ferrus, and the others, the remaining Legion Masters. The Primarchs. We have examined thus far represent perhaps the most famous or most obviously powerful of the Emperor's sons. But the remaining Primarchs each possess their own formidable capabilities and unique strengths that made them valuable to the Great Crusade and dangerous to their enemies. Some of them might have been underestimated by their brothers, their particular talents not lending themselves to the sort of spectacular displays that others favored. Others represented specific types of power that, while not making them supreme in individual combat, made them exceptional at certain forms of warfare. To provide a complete picture of Primarch strength, we must at least briefly examine those gene fathers who have not yet received full treatment. Fulgrim, the Primarch of the Emperor's children, was known before his corruption as perhaps the most perfect embodiment of martial excellence among his brothers. He was not the strongest or the fastest in any absolute sense, but he combined multiple combat attributes with such grace and precision that opponents described fighting him as facing an ideal warrior given flesh. His swordsmanship was legendary, his blade work so refined that every movement served multiple purposes simultaneously. He could fence with opponents using rapier-like precision, while also delivering devastating power strikes when openings appeared. His speed was such that observers reported difficulty tracking his movements with the naked eye, his blade seeming to be in multiple places simultaneously. When the Layer Blade, a demon-possessed sword, came into his possession, it enhanced his already formidable abilities, while also beginning his corruption that would eventually see him transformed into a demon prince of Slaanesh. His confrontations with other Primarchs showcase his capabilities. He killed Ferrus Manus during the Dropsite massacre, beheading his closest brother in a duel that left Fulgrim traumatized despite his victory. That he could defeat Ferrus, who was himself one of the more physically powerful Primarchs, speaks to Fulgrim's combat skills. His post-demon battles, including his encounter with Robut Gilliman, where he wounded the Ultramarines Primarch with a poisoned blade, demonstrate that his ascension to demonhood amplified his already considerable threat level. However, Fulgrim's focus on personal perfection and sensation-seeking made him less effective as a military leader, his legion devolving into hedonistic excess that undermined their combat effectiveness. Ferrus Manus, master of the Iron Hands, possessed physical strength that rivaled even Vulcan's, his arms literally encased in living metal that had bonded with his flesh during his youth on Medusa. This metallic coating granted him strength sufficient to work with molten metal bare-handed, to forge weapons with techniques that even the best human smiths could not replicate. In battle, Ferrus wielded the hammer Forgebreaker, a weapon of such size and weight that it could pulverize armored vehicles. His approach to combat emphasized overwhelming power applied without finesse or mercy, a philosophy that made the Iron Hands one of the most mechanically efficient legions at destroying opposition. His death at Fulgrim's hands represented a major loss for the Imperium, removing one of the Emperor's most dependable sons before his full potential could be realized. Perturabo, Primarch of the Iron Warriors, excelled at siege warfare to such a degree that he became the Imperium's premier expert on both assault and defense of fortifications. His tactical genius focused on systematic application of firepower, the creation of overlapping fields of fire, and the methodical reduction of enemy strongpoints through calculated application of overwhelming force. While not renowned for personal combat ability in the way brothers like Sanguinius or Fulgrim were, Perturabo's effectiveness came through his ability to wage war with mathematical precision. His legion could crack fortresses that had stood for millennia, their expertise at siege work making them invaluable for the compliance of heavily defended worlds. His eventual turn to chaos stemmed partly from feeling underappreciated, believing that his constant deployment in grinding, thankless campaigns represented a lack of respect from his father and brothers. Mortarion, the Death Lord of the Death Guard, represented endurance taken to supernatural extremes even before his ascension to Demon Prince of Nurgle. He could survive in toxic environments that would kill other Primarchs, his body having adapted to the poisonous atmosphere of his homeworld Barbarous. In combat, he wielded the scythe Silence with lethal efficiency, his fighting style emphasizing inexorable advance rather than speed or finesse. Mortarion would simply walk toward his enemies, weathering their attacks through his incredible resilience, until he came within range to strike them down. This approach made him extraordinarily difficult to stop, because conventional tactics of wearing down an opponent through sustained fire proved ineffective against someone who could ignore wounds that would incapacitate others. His transformation into a demon prince amplified these characteristics, making him perhaps the most physically durable of all the fallen Primarchs, even if not the most deadly in direct combat. Jaghatai Khan, the great Khan of the White Scars, specialized in rapid warfare and lightning strikes that left enemies reeling before they could properly respond. His approach to combat emphasized speed and mobility, his forces hitting hard from unexpected angles before disappearing to strike again elsewhere. The Khan himself embodied these principles. His swordsmanship focused on swift, precise strikes rather than prolonged engagements. He understood that the Primarch who could choose when and where to fight held tremendous advantage over enemies forced to respond to his initiatives. His personality and methods sometimes put him at odds with brothers who favored more conventional approaches, but his effectiveness was undeniable. The white scars under his command could appear from nowhere, devastate enemy formations, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. Korax of the Raven Guard represented stealth and precision strikes taken to levels that few others could match. He possessed the ability to seemingly fade into shadows, his movements so swift and silent that enemies often didn't realize he was present until his lightning claws had already torn through them. After the heresy, Korax underwent a transformation that made him something beyond a normal Primarch, able to wield abilities that suggested he had become partially a creature of the warp himself. His skills made him one of the most dangerous Primarchs for assassination and covert operations, though his approach meant he was less effective in the sort of massive set-piece battles that defined much of the Great Crusade. Alpharius and Omegon, the twin Primarchs of the Alpha Legion, present unique challenges in evaluation because their very existence remained secret for much of the Crusade, and their true loyalties and capabilities remain unclear even 10,000 years later. They specialized in infiltration, misinformation, and guerrilla warfare, their methods so subtle that observers often didn't realize the Alpha Legion had been involved until long after battles concluded. Whether they were traitors serving chaos, secret loyalists working to save the Imperium through seemingly traitorous actions, or something else entirely remains a mystery. Their combat abilities in personal duels seemed less exceptional than some brothers, but their capacity to wage war through manipulation and subterfuge made them extremely dangerous in ways that straightforward assessments of combat strength cannot fully capture. Lorgar, once the most physically weak Primarch, underwent tremendous transformation through his embrace of chaos. Before his fall, he was known more for his religious devotion and his skills as an orator than for combat prowess. His word-bearers were often criticized for slow compliance rates because Lorgar insisted on converting worlds to worship of the Emperor rather than simply conquering them. But after his pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror and his full embrace of Chaos Undivided, Lorgar gained powers that elevated him far above his original capabilities. He demonstrated the ability to defeat greater demons in single combat and to wield sorcery that rivaled Magnus's in certain applications. His post-corruption confrontation with Guilliman on Nuceria showed that he could contend with Primarchs who had previously been his clear superiors in combat. Rogel Dawn, the Praetorian of Terror and Primarch of the Imperial Fists, specialized in defensive warfare and fortification to such a degree that his work in preparing Terra's defenses proved crucial to the Imperium's survival during the siege. His personal combat abilities were formidable, but not exceptional by Primarch standards. He was competent in most martial disciplines without being supreme in any particular one. His true strength lay in his strategic thinking regarding defense, his understanding of how to create interlocking defensive systems that made positions nearly impossible to assault successfully. The Imperial Fists under his command became legendary for their expertise at turning any position into a fortress, and for their stubborn refusal to yield ground once they had committed to defending it. These brief examinations illustrate that the question of strength among Primarchs cannot be reduced to simple rankings. Each possessed capabilities that made them valuable in certain contexts, while presenting vulnerabilities in others. A Primarch who excelled at siege warfare might be less effective in mobile campaigns. One who was supreme in individual duels might be outmaneuvered by a more tactically flexible opponent. The strongest Primarch, in many cases, was simply the one whose particular strengths aligned with the situation at hand. The Measure of Titans. Conclusion. We have journeyed through the legends and battles of the Emperor's greatest creations, examining the strengths and weaknesses of demigods whose actions shaped the entire galaxy. From Horus's terrible fall and redemption-denying end to Sanguinius's noble sacrifice. From the lion's enigmatic prowess to Vulcan's undying endurance. From Magnus's tragic corruption to Angron's enslaved fury. Each Primarch represented a different aspect of what humanity could become when elevated beyond its natural limitations, and each paid their own price for the power they wielded. The question we began with, who is the strongest Primarch, reveals itself to be far more complex than it initially appeared. Strength manifests in countless forms, each valid in its own context. Is the strongest Primarch the one who can lift the most weight? By that measure, Vulcan stands supreme, his physical power acknowledged even by brothers who exceeded him in other areas. Is it the most skilled warrior in single combat? Sanguinius holds that honor according to the consensus of his peers, his martial excellence unmatched even by those who possessed greater raw power. Is it the most powerful psychic? Magnus the Red wielded sorcery that rivaled the Emperor's own before his fall, though his ascension to Demon Prince amplified those abilities still further. Perhaps the strongest is the Primarch, who could defeat the most opponents in individual combat. By that measure, chaos-empowered Horus might claim the title, as it took the Emperor's full power to destroy him. Or should we measure strength by strategic impact? Reboot Guilliman's Codex. Astartes has shaped imperial military doctrine for 10 millennia, his influence extending across ages long after his physical form was placed in stasis. The most comprehensive Primarch, the one who excelled in the widest range of disciplines. Again, Guilliman presents a strong case, though Horus before his fall might have exceeded even the Ultramarines' Gene-Father in all-around capability. Combat records provide some guidance, but also contradiction. Sanguinius wounded Horus before falling, yet lost the fight. Russ broke Magnus's back, but Magnus survived through demonic intervention. The lion matched Russ blow for blow before felling him with what many consider a sucker punch. Angron beat Russ in their brawl, but found himself surrounded by space wolves. Fulgrim killed Ferrus Manus, yet was himself consumed by demonic possession in the process. Guilliman could not defeat Magnus alone, but prevailed through superior tactics and positioning. These battles show that context, preparation, and circumstance matter as much as inherent capability. The transformations wrought by chaos further complicate comparisons. The demon Primarchs gained immense power through their ascension, becoming beings whose capabilities far exceeded their mortal forms. Angron, as a demon prince of Horn, likely surpasses his pre-corruption self in raw combat ability by several orders of magnitude. Magnus's sorcery, already formidable, became truly godlike after Tzeentch claimed him. But these empowerments came at a cost that extends beyond morality. They became slaves to the dark gods, their actions ultimately serving chaos rather than their own purposes. The strength they gained was real, but not freely wielded. A puppet moving with tremendous force is still a puppet. If we focus specifically on loyalist Primarchs in their pre-heresy forms, the top tier of individual combatants likely includes Sanguinius at the peak, followed closely by the Lion, Leman Russ, and Horus before his fall. Just below that level, we might place Fulgrim, Ferrus Manus, and perhaps Vulcan, each excelling in particular aspects of combat. In the middle tier, we find Primarchs like Guilliman, Dawn, and the Khan, all formidable warriors, but not quite matching the supreme fighters in pure combatability. The lower tier, at least in terms of personal dueling skill, includes Magnus when deprived of psychic powers, Lorgar before his empowerment, and perhaps Perturabo, whose strengths lay more in strategic thinking than individual combat prowess. But these rankings shift dramatically when we account for different combat scenarios. In an environment where psychic powers function freely, Magnus leaps to near the top of any list. In siege warfare, Perturabo's expertise makes him more valuable than supposedly superior combatants. In void warfare or planetary defense, Dawn's capabilities exceed those of brothers who might best him in single combat. The strongest Primarch for a deep strike assassination mission differs from the strongest for a prolonged campaign or the strongest for defending a key position. Context is not merely relevant, it is determinative. The modern era adds another layer of complexity. Only Guilliman and the Lion remain active among loyalist Primarchs, while several demon princes serve chaos. Direct comparisons between the living and the fallen become difficult because their natures have diverged so dramatically. Guilliman, empowered by the Emperor's sword, represents a different level of capability than his heresy-era self. The Lion, enhanced by his connection to the warp-touched mirror Caliban, possesses abilities his original form lacked. Meanwhile, the demon Primarchs have become beings whose power derives partly from their patron's continued favor, making their strength conditional in ways that transcend simple measurement. Perhaps the most honest answer is that there is no single strongest Primarch. Each was designed to excel in specific areas, and comparing them requires us to specify both the type of strength we're measuring and the context in which they're operating. In individual combat under ideal conditions for each participant, Sanguinius likely edges out the others through his combination of skill, grace, and martial excellence. In terms of raw physical power, Vulcan stands supreme. For psychic might, Magnus exceeds all others. In strategic thinking and comprehensive capability, Guilliman or pre-corruption Horus would take the honor. For pure killing efficiency in close combat, Demon Prince Angron might claim the title. For endurance and resilience, Vulcan's perpetual nature makes him effectively invincible. The strongest Primarch, it turns out, depends entirely on how we define strength. What we can say with certainty is that the Primarchs, in all their varied excellence and tragic flaws, represented the pinnacle of what genetically engineered warriors could achieve. They were beings who strode across battlefields like gods of war, whose decisions shaped the fates of billions, whose lives became legends that endure across 10,000 years of bloodshed and struggle. The Imperium they helped build, flawed and burdened as it is, stands as their testament. The threats they defeated remain defeated. The worlds they brought to compliance remain, by and large, human. And the hope that one or more of the lost Primarchs might yet return to guide humanity through its darkest age continues to burn in the hearts of trillions who will never see a Primarch with their own eyes, but who believe nonetheless in the power of the Emperor's sons. In the end, perhaps the true measure of a Primarch's strength lies not in how many opponents he could defeat or how much weight he could lift, but in the legacy he left behind. By that standard, Sanguinius might be strongest for the inspiration his sacrifice continues to provide. Guilliman for the systems he created that sustain the Imperium. Vulcan for the compassion he showed to common humans. Even the traitor Primarchs left legacies, though theirs are of cautionary tales and dark warnings about the price of ambition, pride, and despair. They were the Emperor's sons, each reflecting an aspect of his grand design, each possessing strength sufficient to reshape the galaxy. That they used that strength in ways their father never intended, or that they fell short of their potential, or that they sacrificed themselves in doomed gestures, does not diminish the magnitude of what they were, and in some cases, still are. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the mightiest warriors the Imperium ever produced, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. The galaxy is vast and filled with stories worth telling. From the countless Space Marine chapters carrying on their Primarchs' legacies, to the Xenos threats that press in from all sides, from the Chaos forces that corrupt from within, to the heroes who stand against the darkness. There are always more tales to explore, more legends to examine, more questions to answer about the grim darkness of the far future. Until next time, remember, in the darkness of the 41st millennium, there is only war. But there are also those who wage that war with such skill, such power, and such determination that even 10,000 years cannot dim their legend. The Primarchs were, are, and shall always be the Emperor's greatest gifts to humanity and the tools by which our species carved out an empire among the stars.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.